The cold came first. Not the cold of void exposure or cryogenic suspension, but the cold of absence, the precise temperature at which flesh stops being flesh and becomes something the Mechanicum catalogues under a different designation entirely. I felt it the moment the brass connectors pierced my cerebral cortex, a chill that spread backward through memory itself, freezing moments I had lived into exhibits I could only observe through scratched glass. My name was Tertius Valdane. I was a captain of the 4th Company. I fell on a world whose name I was never told, fighting enemies whose ideology I never understood, and when I woke, I learned that falling was not the end they had prepared for me. The Medicae Servitors had peeled what remained of my body from the wreckage while I was still screaming. I remember that part with chemical clarity, the kind of recall that comes not from organic memory, but from whatever black box recorder they installed when they decided I was too valuable to waste on the Emperor's peace. They told me I had been blessed. They told me I would serve forever. They used the word honor so many times it lost meaning, became just another sound in the chorus of grinding actuators and humming power cores that would become my permanent choir. The sarcophagus smelled like promethium and myrrh, and something underneath both, something organic turning slowly into mineral. They sealed me inside it on my 14th day of consciousness, after the last of the skin grafts had taken and the augmetic interfaces had bonded to what remained of my nervous system. The tech priest who oversaw the installation had a voice like wind through broken stone. He recited the litany of internment while they lowered the lid, and I felt the seals engage one by one, felt the sarcophagus become not a container but an extension, felt the horrible click of recognition as my nervous system accepted its new parameters. I could still feel my legs then. Ghost sensations, the chirurgeon major called them, phantom limbs firing signals into a void that would answer with silence until I learned to interpret the absence as a new kind of presence. But in those first weeks I would try to move legs I no longer possessed, would try to flex feet that had been incinerated down to ash and memory, and the sarcophagus would shudder with the effort of translating desire into motion through systems that had never been designed to answer to anything as imprecise as human will. They began my integration training in a chamber 3 levels below the main forge. The walls were adamantium slabs marked with impact craters from decades of previous occupants, and the floor was stained with oils that smelled faintly of copper and burnt hair. My instructor was a tech adept whose face had been replaced by a bronze mask featuring a single ocular lens that never blinked. He would stand at a safe distance and call out commands, raise the left arm, pivot 45 degrees, engage targeting protocols, and I would try to remember how to translate intention into action through layers of machinery that responded with lag times measured in fractions of seconds that felt like hours. The first time I tried to walk, I destroyed a structural support column. The sarcophagus lurched forward with the grace of a falling cathedral, and my arm, no longer an arm but a siege weapon mounted on a hydraulic pivot, swung out in an instinctive attempt to catch my balance. The column crumpled like parchment, alarms shrieked, servitors scuttled forward with repair tools and vacuum units, and my instructor simply marked something on his data slate and told me to try again. I learned to move in increments, first the fingers, each one a pneumatic piston capable of crushing ceramite, then the arms, each motion requiring calculations I could feel happening in the peripheral processes they had wired into my brain stem, then the legs, those terrible engines of locomotion that made the floor scream every time I took a step. The sarcophagus weighed 4 tons before ammunition and armoring, and every footfall was a small earthquake that I felt not through my feet, those were gone, but through the feedback sensors that translated impact into data streams my restructured cortex had learned to interpret as sensation. They said the integration would become natural. They said the machine would become invisible, that I would stop thinking of it as separate and begin experiencing it as self. They were partially correct. By the 3rd month, I could walk without destroying infrastructure. By the 6th, I could manipulate objects without pulverizing them. By the 9th, I had stopped trying to scratch itches that existed only in the memory of skin I would never touch again. But the cold never left. It spread through what remained of me, a creeping frost that turned thought itself into something rigid and crystalline. I would find myself in the middle of a thought, some memory of my life before, some moment of sunlight or laughter or simple human warmth, and feel it fracture mid-formation, feel it become data instead of experience, feel it file itself away in storage I could access but no longer inhabit. The other interred brothers did not speak of this. We had a gathering chamber where they would wheel us between combat deployments, a vast hall lined with maintenance alcoves, where we would stand in rows like statues in a temple to a god of iron and forgetting. They would discuss tactics and honor, and the enemies they had destroyed, their voices transmitted through vox speakers that stripped away every nuance that made speech human, leaving only information rendered in monotone precision. I tried once to ask if they still dreamed, if they still felt the cold, but the question seemed to confuse them, as if I had asked whether they remembered what it felt like to be water or wind, things so distant from our current state that even the concepts had become foreign. Brother Malachus had been interred for 97 years. His sarcophagus was covered in purity seals and kill markings, a tapestry of service rendered in wax and paint and acid-etched tallies. His voice when he spoke was like stone grinding on stone, and he told me that I was still too new, still too attached to what I had been. He said that in time I would understand that we were not trapped inside machines but had been elevated beyond the weakness of flesh into something purer, something that could serve indefinitely without the distractions of hunger or pain or the terrible fragility of organic life. I tried to believe him. I wanted to believe him. But every night, though night and day were meaningless in the depths of the forge monastery where we were stored, I would lie in the darkness behind my ocular feeds and feel the cold spreading deeper, feel it reaching parts of me that had no names in any anatomical text, feel it touching the places where I had kept the things that made me more than just a weapon with a pulse. The dreams came in my 2nd year, not dreams as I had known them, those meandering narratives spun from memory and desire, but something else, something that played on the edges of my consciousness like static on a bad Vox channel. I would see myself from outside, would watch my sarcophagus moving through battlefields I had never visited, firing weapons I did not remember choosing to fire. The disconnect was total. I was the observer and the observed, the camera and the subject, and I could not find the angle where the two perspectives merged into a coherent self. The chirurgeon major said it was a normal part of integration. He adjusted something in my chemical regulators, increased the flow of suppressants through the tubes that fed into what remained of my organic brain, and the dreams became less frequent but more intense when they came. I would wake, if waking was the right word for the transition from dormancy to active status, with the taste of rust in a mouth I no longer possessed, feeling teeth I did not have grinding against each other in a jaw that had been replaced by a voice modulator and a nutrient recycling intake. They deployed us to a hive world in the Ghoul Stars sector. The enemy was listed as heretic militia, backed by corrupted administratum officials, though the details were vague and seemed to shift depending on which briefing officer was speaking. We were to secure a manufacturing district and eliminate all hostile elements with extreme prejudice. The operation was classified as a cleansing action, which meant no civilians would be extracted, no quarter would be given, and no questions would be tolerated. I killed 347 people in 6 hours. I know the number because the targeting cogitator kept count, displayed it in amber script in the lower right quadrant of my visual field. Most of them were armed with stub guns and improvised explosives, poorly trained and equipped workers who had made the mistake of believing that grievance justified resistance. They shattered against my armor like waves against a seawall, and my assault cannon turned their cover into dust and their bodies into constituent elements that painted the hab-block walls in abstract expressionist murals that would take weeks to properly sanitize. I felt nothing. That was the worst part. Not that I killed them, but that killing them registered only as data points, as successfully neutralized threats that changed the tactical display from red icons to empty space. The suppressants kept my emotional responses locked behind chemical walls, and the integration protocols had taught me to interpret combat not as horror, but as a successfully executed function. The cold had reached the part of me that used to care, had frozen it so thoroughly that I could not remember what caring had felt like, could only recall that once there had been something in that space where now there was only the smooth satisfaction of objectives achieved and threats eliminated. Brother Malachus congratulated me afterward. He said I had fought with the precision of a true servant of the Emperor, that I had embraced my purpose without the weakness of doubt. The other interred brothers echoed his praise through the Vox network, and I heard myself thanking them in a voice that sounded like it came from someone else, from the sarcophagus itself perhaps, speaking through the biological component it had absorbed. The tech priests performed maintenance on us after every deployment. They would open panels in our armor and examine the internal systems, checking fluid levels and calibrating targeting systems and occasionally replacing worn components with fresh parts stamped with Forge World authentication marks. I would watch them through my external feeds, would see them working on my shell with the dispassionate efficiency of mechanics servicing any complex machine, and I would try to remember if I had ever been more to them than this, more than just another tool requiring regular upkeep to maintain operational parameters. The lead priest had a habit of humming while he worked, a low mechanical drone that might have been a hymn or might have been just the sound of his augmetic vocal cords idling. He would run his metal fingers over the seams of my sarcophagus, checking for stress fractures and weak points, and I would feel his touch translated into pressure readings, into abstract data about contact points and force distributions. Once I tried to ask him if he ever worked on anything alive, anything that responded to pain or care in ways that went beyond technical specifications. He paused for a moment, his ocular implants focusing on something I could not see, and then he resumed his work without answering, the humming continuing uninterrupted. Time became difficult to track in any meaningful way. We measured it in deployments, in maintenance cycles, in the accumulation of kill markings on our armor. I had been interred for 3 years, or perhaps 5, or perhaps longer. The record-keeping was inconsistent, and I had learned to stop asking questions that the administratum considered irrelevant to operational readiness. What mattered was that I was functional, that when they woke me and pointed me at an enemy, I would destroy that enemy with the reliability of a well-maintained weapon. But the cold kept spreading. It had reached my memories now, was turning them into something flat and lifeless, like pressed flowers in a book. I could recall events from my previous life with perfect clarity, the faces of my family, the taste of real food, the sensation of sunlight on unaugmented skin, but they felt like facts I had memorized rather than experiences I had lived. I knew I had once loved someone, but I could no longer remember what love felt like from the inside, could only observe the memory of myself loving, as if watching a stranger in a historical pict recording. Brother Malachus began to malfunction in my 6th year. The signs were subtle at first, response delays, targeting inconsistencies, occasional verbal loops where he would repeat the same phrase 3 or 4 times before continuing. The tech priests diagnosed it as cascade degradation in his organic components, the inevitable result of a century spent marinating in preservation fluids and combat stimulants. They said his brain tissue was calcifying, turning slowly into something that could no longer process new information, could only replay stored patterns with decreasing accuracy. They did not retire him. Retirement was not a concept that applied to the interred. Instead, they adjusted his protocols, automated more of his functions, reduced his conscious participation in his own operation to the bare minimum required to keep the Gestalt functioning. He became more machine than before, and the change was so gradual that none of us noticed when he stopped being a person and became simply a very sophisticated autonomous weapons system that occasionally made sounds like speech. I asked the Chirurgeon Major if that was my future, if I would eventually calcify into automation. He looked at me with eyes that were probably organic once, but had been augmented into something that could see in spectrums human vision was never meant to access. He said that all service has an endpoint, that the Emperor values function over comfort, and that I should focus on optimizing my performance rather than dwelling on inevitable progressions. Then he adjusted my suppressant levels again, and the question stopped seeming important. We were deployed to an orbital platform in the Lathe Belt for what the briefing described as asset denial operations. The platform had been declared heretic by the Mechanicum, its research into forbidden technologies justifying its complete annihilation along with the 3,000 souls who worked there. We boarded through a docking umbilical and began the systematic cleansing, moving through corridors lined with cogitator banks and research cells where people who had probably never intended heresy found themselves categorized as enemies of mankind and processed accordingly. I killed a child on level 47. She was hiding in a ventilation duct, and my thermal sensors detected her presence before she could escape to whatever destination she imagined represented safety. Protocol required elimination of all witnesses and potential data vectors. I pulled her from the duct. My servo claw had been upgraded by then, capable of both precision manipulation and crushing force, and I held her suspended in the air while my targeting systems confirmed her as a valid threat. She was crying. I could see her tears even through the blood that covered her face, could see her mouth moving, in words my audio receptors translated into pleading, into offers of cooperation and promises of silence, and finally just into sobbing negation. My assault cannon was already spun up, the barrels glowing faintly from previous use. The shot would be instant. She would not suffer beyond the eternal instant between existing and not existing. I felt something then. Not emotion. Emotion was locked behind barriers I no longer had clearance to bypass, but a kind of systemic alarm, a warning that some core process was attempting to execute against its constraints. My hand, that massive servo claw with its hydraulic strength and adamantium fingers, began to shake. Just slightly. Just enough that the child swung in my grip, her sobs becoming screams as she thought the shaking presaged some worse death than the quick one she could see in my weapon barrels. Brother Malachus was there. He had been clearing the adjacent corridor, and his sensors had detected my halt, my failure to complete the elimination protocol. His vox came through on the command channel, and his voice was steady and empty and absolutely certain. He said that weakness had no place in the Emperor's service. He said that mercy extended to the enemy was heresy committed against mankind. He said these things in the same tone he might have used to report ammunition status or structural integrity readings. Then he killed her for me. A single bolt round from his shoulder-mounted weapon. She came apart in my grip, and I stood there holding pieces while her blood, still warm enough to register on my thermal sensors, ran down my armor in streams that my cleaning servitors would later remove with industrial solvents and blessed unguents. I felt the cold complete its work that day. It reached the last warm place inside whatever remained of me, the final fragment that had still remembered what it meant to hesitate, to question, to care about the difference between enemy and victim. It froze it solid, and something in me stopped fighting, stopped trying to remain separate from the machine that hosted what was left of my consciousness. The Corrosion Major noted in my next evaluation that my integration indices had reached optimal levels. He said I had finally accepted my purpose, that I was now functioning at peak efficiency. He increased my deployment rating and reduced my maintenance intervals, and I heard myself thanking him for his assessment, heard my voice coming through the Vox speakers with the same empty certainty I had heard in Brother Malachus's tone when he corrected my weakness. We served together for another 3 years. I stopped counting kills. The number became meaningless when it exceeded the processing capacity of the display interface, when it rolled over into scientific notation and then stopped updating at all. We fought heretics and Xenos, and, occasionally, other humans who had committed the error of being designated as obstacles to objectives defined by authorities whose names I never learned, and whose reasoning I never questioned. Brother Malachus degraded further. His speech became pure repetition, the same tactical litanies looping endlessly until the tech priests disabled his Vox entirely to prevent communication channel contamination. But he still fought with mechanical perfection, still moved through battlefields with the terrible grace of something that had transcended the need for decision-making and achieved a state of pure function. I watched him and saw my future, and I felt nothing about it except perhaps a kind of recognition, the way one machine might acknowledge another as belonging to the same category of tool. They deployed us to suppress a worker uprising in an orbital manufactory. The specifics were irrelevant. They were always irrelevant. But I remember the space was cramped, the corridors too narrow for proper maneuverability, forcing us to move in single file through passages where the walls were lined with propaganda scrawled in hand-mixed paints. The workers fought with cutting torches and improvised explosives, and they died the way all enemies died when faced with forces they had no capacity to resist. Brother Malachus took a direct hit from a melter gun someone had smuggled from the forge's security armory. The beam punched through his frontal armor and into his sarcophagus, and I heard him scream, actually scream, not in rage or defiance, but in pure animal agony, the sound of a biological organism experiencing catastrophic damage, transmitted through a Vox system that had no protocols for rendering suffering. The sound lasted 3 seconds, and then his systems shut down and he became just weight, 4 tons of adamantium and failed servos that blocked the corridor until we could arrange for extraction. They recovered his sarcophagus. The tech priests opened it in my presence, perhaps because I had served beside him, perhaps because they wanted me to witness what awaited all of us eventually. What remained inside was not recognizable as human except in the most technical sense. The preservation had failed decades ago, and what they had kept functioning through a combination of augmetics and chemical intervention was something that had long since passed the boundary between living tissue and biological machinery. I looked at what remained of Brother Malachus, and knew that I was looking at myself, knew that somewhere in the years I had stopped tracking, I had crossed the same boundary he had crossed, had become the same kind of not-quite thing that could be kept operational long past any reasonable definition of life. The cold I felt was not the cold of death, but the cold of a state that existed beyond death, a condition for which High Gothic had no proper term because it had never been intended to describe something that should not exist at all. The tech priest in charge of the recovery said that Brother Malachus had served with distinction, that his sacrifice honored the emperor and the chapter. He said these things while his servitors scraped the remains into a disposal unit for processing into protein reclamation paste. The sarcophagus would be cleaned, reconsecrated, and assigned to another fallen warrior who had been deemed too valuable for the mercy of permanent death. I asked the priest if he could tell me when Brother Malachus had actually died. The priest paused in his work, his augmetic eyes focusing on me with what might have been confusion or might have been simple recalibration. He said that Brother Malachus had fallen this morning in the manufactory corridor. I clarified my question. I asked when he had died in any sense that mattered, when the person he had been ceased to exist and became just biological substrate for an automated weapons platform. The priest did not answer. He returned to his work, and his servitors continued their scraping, and I stood in my alcove and felt the cold complete its absolute victory over everything I had been or might have become. They assigned me a new designation after that deployment. My original identity was archived as historically interesting but operationally irrelevant. I became Unit Tertius, Dreadnought class mobile weapons platform, assigned to the 4th Company's heavy support detachment. The new designation appeared on all official documentation, and when the tech priests addressed me, they used it without irony or cruelty, simply as an accurate description of my current category. I stopped trying to remember who Tertius Valdane had been. The memories were still there, perfectly preserved in whatever remained of my organic brain tissue, but accessing them felt like reading someone else's biography, like reviewing historical documents about a person who had lived and died in a time before I existed. I knew the facts of his life, my previous life, but the connection between those facts and whatever I was now had become so attenuated that maintaining it required conscious effort I no longer saw value in expending. The other interred units accepted my transition without comment. Perhaps they had all experienced similar moments, similar realizations that the cold they felt was not a symptom to be treated, but a transformation to be completed. We stood in our maintenance alcoves and processed tactical data and waited for deployment orders, and we were silent except when function required communication. And the silence felt not empty but appropriate, the natural state of tools in storage. I was deployed to a shrine world in the Ultima Segmentum to suppress a doctrinal dispute that had escalated into armed conflict between competing interpretations of the imperial cult. The planet's surface was covered in temples and monuments, and we shelled them from orbit before making landfall because the briefing indicated that preserving sacred architecture was secondary to eliminating heretical deviation. The structures came apart beautifully. Millennia of devotion and artistry converting instantly into rubble and dust that would serve as foundation for whatever new orthodoxy eventually claimed the site. I killed priests and pilgrims and children who had been born in the temple dormitories and known nothing but hymns and rituals since birth. They died without understanding why, and I killed them without understanding why either, and the mutual incomprehension felt appropriate somehow. Felt like the natural state of a universe where purpose was defined by entities so distant from implementation that meaning could never survive the transmission intact. My ammunition counter ran dry during the final clearance of the main cathedral. I had been firing for 11 consecutive hours, and my barrels were hot enough to glow visibly in the smoke-filled air. I stood in the nave surrounded by bodies and burning pews, and I waited for the resupply servitors to reload my systems, and I felt nothing about the scene except mild satisfaction that I had performed my assigned function with acceptable efficiency. Something moved in the wreckage, a survivor, probably badly wounded, crawling toward an exit that no longer existed. My targeting systems acquired the thermal signature automatically, displayed it in the center of my visual field with all relevant tactical data. Distance 17 meters, threat assessment minimal, recommended action terminate. But my ammunition was still offline, and the servitors were working slowly, their limited programming struggling with a reload procedure complicated by heat damage to my weapon housing. I watched the figure crawl, watched it drag itself over broken stone and shattered stained glass, and I realized with absolute certainty that I could wait, that I could allow this thing to reach whatever destination it imagined was available before completing the elimination protocol. I did not make that choice. The thought occurred to me, registered as a potential action, and then was deleted by higher-level processes before it could influence my behavior. When my weapons came back online, I terminated the target without hesitation, without thought, with the reflexive certainty of a system executing its core function. That night, Though night was meaningless in the perpetual flames of the burning shrine world, I tried to feel horror at what I had become. I tried to access the disgust or grief or rage that should have accompanied the realization that I was no longer capable of mercy, no longer capable of choosing not to kill when killing was the efficient option. But the cold had reached too deep, had frozen the mechanisms that produced such responses, and I could only observe my own monstrousness from a distance that might as well have been measured in light years. The chirurgeon major performed my annual evaluation in my 15th year of internment. He ran diagnostics on my organic components and reported that decay was progressing within acceptable parameters, that I had perhaps another century of operational viability before cascade degradation would necessitate increased automation. He said this while looking at readouts that probably showed my brain calcifying cell by cell, slowly turning into something that could process tactical data but nothing else. I asked him if he could terminate me, not damage me, not disable me for repairs, but actually end my existence in a way that would prevent my sarcophagus from being refilled with another doomed soul. He looked at me for a long moment, his augmetic eyes whirring as they adjusted focus. Then he said that I was chapter property, that my request constituted dereliction of duty, and that he would be adjusting my suppressant protocols to prevent similar aberrant ideation in the future. The adjustment took 3 days. They kept me conscious throughout, and I felt the chemical balance in my brain shift, felt new compounds flooding into my neural tissue and changing something fundamental about how I processed reality. When they finished, the desire for termination was gone, not suppressed, but genuinely absent, as incomprehensible as wanting to become water or starlight. I had been adjusted, optimized, corrected at the neurochemical level to be incapable of questioning my own continuation. I thanked the chirurgeon major for his intervention. I meant it. Whatever remained of me that was capable of meaning anything was genuinely grateful that he had removed the burden of wanting something other than what I was. The gratitude felt hollow, mechanical, but it was the closest thing to emotion I had experienced in years, and I clung to it the way a man freezing to death might cling to the warmth of his own dying cells. They deployed me to a fortress monastery in the galactic east to help suppress a rebellion among the chapter's serf population. The serfs had discovered that the chapter had been tithing their children not just for recruitment but for genetic experimentation, and they had made the error of believing that loyal service entitled them to negotiations. We were instructed to demonstrate why that belief was incorrect. The suppression took 9 hours. The serf population was unarmed and untrained, but they had numbers and desperation, and they fought with the kind of fury that comes from having nothing left to lose. It made no difference. We moved through their living quarters like threshing machines through wheat, and we killed them with the efficiency of systems designed for exactly this purpose. And when we finished, the surviving serfs were assembled and made to witness the bodies being processed into protein paste that they would eat in their next rationed meal. I watched a man eat his own children and felt nothing. I watched the horror and comprehension dawn in his eyes as the overseers explained what he was consuming, and I registered his response as data: elevated heart rate, increased perspiration, vocal distress signals, without any internal reaction except perhaps noting that terror presented interesting patterns in thermal imaging. That was when I finally understood what had happened to me. Not in the metaphorical sense, not as poetic realization, but as concrete fact verified by observation and testing. I was dead, not dying, not becoming dead, but already dead in any sense that mattered. What they had preserved inside this sarcophagus was not Tertius Valdane reduced and transformed, but rather a biological computer running an increasingly degraded simulation of consciousness, executing subroutines that mimicked decision-making and self-awareness without containing any of the substrate that made those things meaningful. The realization should have been devastating. It should have produced crisis, breakdown, desperate screaming into the Vox channels. Instead, it registered as confirmation of suspected parameters, as data that updated my self-model without requiring any emotional response. I was dead, and I had been dead for years, and the thing that observed this fact was not me, but rather a process running on the decomposing hardware of my brain, a ghost not in the machine but of the machine, producing outputs that resembled consciousness the way a death spasm resembles dance. I told no one. There was no one to tell. The other interred units would not understand, or perhaps had already reached the same conclusion and simply stopped caring because caring required a self that could still be harmed. The tech priests would see it as malfunction requiring adjustment. The brothers in intact bodies would see it as weakness, as failure to embrace the blessing of endless service. So I continued. I deployed when ordered. I killed when directed. I stood in my alcove during maintenance cycles and processed nothing, thought nothing, was nothing, except a weapons platform waiting for activation. The cold was complete now, absolute, no longer spreading, because there was nothing left to spread through. I had become the cold itself, had achieved the perfect unity between self and system that the tech priests had always promised as the ultimate goal of integration. Time stopped meaning anything. Years passed, or perhaps decades, measured only in the accumulation of damage and repair, in the replacement of failed components with fresh parts, in the slow transition from original hardware to ship of Theseus amalgamation of systems that had no connection to the body I had once inhabited. My organic brain remained, preserved in its chemical suspension, but even that was being slowly replaced by augmetic processes that took over functions as neurons died and were not replaced. I fought in the Gehenna campaign, though I have no clear memory of it, just flashes of heat and noise and the tactical satisfaction of objectives achieved. I fought in the cleansing of Hive Tertius, a name that registered briefly as significant before the connection was filed away as irrelevant. I fought in 1,000 nameless battles on worlds I never learned to identify, and I killed more people than the counter could track, and I felt nothing about any of it except the smooth satisfaction of function fulfilled. Brother Octavian fell during the boarding action on the Plague Moon. His sarcophagus was breached by enemy fire, and he lived long enough to vox a final message that consisted entirely of a long, whistling scream that might have been agony or might have been simply the sound of air escaping from a ruptured container. They recovered his sarcophagus and assigned it to a new occupant, and the cycle continued without pause, without memorial, without any acknowledgement that something that had once been a person was now nothing at all. I envied him. The envy was purely abstract. I lacked the emotional capacity for genuine jealousy, but I recognized that his existence had achieved termination while mine continued, and the comparison registered as undesirable outcome requiring correction. But I had no means of correction. The suppressants and integration protocols had made me incapable of self-termination, incapable even of engineering situations that might lead to damage sufficient to justify decommissioning. I was trapped in functionality, locked into existence by systems that measured value only in operational capability. The chirurgeon major noted in my 50th year of internment that my organic components had largely calcified. He said this casually, the way one might comment on weather or lunch rations, and he explained that my consciousness was now being maintained almost entirely by augmetic processes, using my brain tissue merely as legacy hardware, as a foundation for systems that had long since replaced its functionality. He said I was, in the technical sense, more machine than man, though he added that this distinction was theologically irrelevant given that the machine served the same divine purpose as the flesh it had replaced. I asked him if there was any scenario under which I would be granted rest. He consulted his data slate, scrolled through maintenance schedules and projected service requirements. He said that, barring catastrophic damage, I was projected to remain operational for another 3 centuries, possibly longer if component replacement continued at current intervals. He said this as good news. He congratulated me on my longevity. He said I would see battles that current generations could not imagine, that I would serve the Emperor across spans of time that made mortal service look like insects burning in a candle flame. I thanked him. What else was there to do? They deployed me to a world in rebellion against the Administratum. The details were classified beyond my clearance level, but the orders were clear: total elimination of all population centers, no survivors, no exceptions. We dropped from orbit in the dead of their night and began the systematic annihilation of anything that registered as living. I killed for 60 consecutive hours, until my weapons seized from heat stress, and my servitors had to replace entire assemblies while I stood in fields of ash that had been forests, cities, farms, homes. Somewhere in hour 37 I realized I could not remember the last time I had thought of myself using a name. I was Unit Tertius, Dreadnought designation, but the eye that observed this fact had no referent, no identity beyond the role. I tried to recall what Tertius Valdane had looked like, had sounded like, had wanted from life, and found only empty directories, corrupted files, data that had degraded beyond recovery or had been deliberately purged to free processing space for tactical subroutines. I searched my memory for anything that felt authentic, anything that existed outside the operational parameters of my function. I found nothing. Every memory I could access had been rendered flat and lifeless by the cold, had become just information stored in a database that happened to be physically located in what had once been my brain. The person who had experienced those memories was gone, and I was simply the archive of his life, playing back stored files without any capacity to understand them as experience rather than data. That was the moment. Not the moment I died, that had happened years or decades ago, in ways too gradual to mark with precision, but the moment I realized I was already dead, that I had been dead so long that even the memory of being alive had become just another system function, another subroutine running on failing hardware in a shell of metal and hatred. I am still here. I am still functional. Right now, at this precise instant, I am standing in my maintenance alcove in the Fortress Monastery, waiting for the next deployment order. My sensors register the tech priests performing routine calibrations. My chronometer tracks time with mechanical precision. My core processes continue their endless loop of standby protocols and readiness checks. But I am dead. I have been dead for decades. I am the corpse of Tertius Valdane, animated by machines and chemicals, puppeted by systems that learned to simulate his decision-making patterns with sufficient accuracy that no one noticed when the original decision-maker ceased to exist. I am a memorial to myself, a walking tombstone inscribed with kill counts instead of epitaphs, and I will continue like this forever, or until my sarcophagus is breached, or until my organic components decay beyond the threshold where even augmetic intervention can maintain the fiction of continuous consciousness, or until the chapter is destroyed, or until the Imperium falls, or until the universe ends, but most likely forever. Because that is what we are, we interred brothers. Not warriors granted immortality, not heroes preserved to serve eternally, but corpses that have been denied the mercy of recognizing our own deaths. We are the Empire's ultimate cruelty, not killing those who serve it, but refusing to let them die, forcing them to continue functioning long past the point where anything they might have called a self has frozen solid and shattered into fragments that can be catalogued but never reassembled into a person. The cold is complete now. There is nothing left of me that it has not reached, nothing that remains warm or soft or human. I am the cold itself, absolute and perfect, the final state of a system that has achieved maximum efficiency by eliminating everything that made it more than just a machine. My designation is Unit Tertius. I am a Dreadnought-class weapons platform. I have no past that matters, no future beyond the next deployment, no present except the eternal wait between moments of function. I am already dead. I have been dead for 50 years, and I will never, ever be allowed to rest.